Jacob Ward pushed his toy truck across the living room floor. The front wheel caught. He backed it up and tried again. Same spot. His mother, Melissa, crossed the room and knelt beside him. A few weeks earlier, people had laughed when she paid $1 for this house. Now her fingertips were moving across an old floorboard, searching for the tiny ridge that had stopped Jacob's truck. She found it. Melissa worked the edge of a borrowed pry bar beneath the plank. The wood resisted, gave a dry crack, and lifted. Dust rose into the afternoon light. Beneath the floor was a shallow pocket of darkness. Melissa reached inside. Her fingers touched cold metal. Someone had hidden something there. Not long before that discovery, Melissa Ward had been trying to keep any roof at all over her son's head. She was 29 years old and raising 6-year-old Jacob alone. Her husband had died in a construction accident 3 years earlier. After his death, daily life became a matter of fitting one responsibility around the next. Melissa worked breakfast shifts at a roadside diner. She picked Jacob up from school. She made dinner. Later, when he was settled for the night, she cleaned office buildings. There was little room for anything to go wrong. One evening, Melissa carried 2 bags of discounted groceries toward their apartment. She had spent the last $20 in her wallet. An orange notice was fixed across the door. Her landlord, Mr. Reynolds, appeared in the hallway while she was still reading it. Melissa asked for another week. Her paycheck was coming Friday. Reynolds told her he had already waited as long as he could. Across the paper were the words Melissa feared most. Vacate within 72 hours. She waited until Reynolds had gone before stepping inside. Jacob was sitting on the floor with crayons around him. He held up a picture of a small house with smoke rising from the chimney. Christmas lights stretched across the roof. "That's us," he said. Melissa folded the notice and slipped it into her coat pocket before he could see it. The next day, the problem became more serious. Jacob had an asthma attack at school. Melissa left the diner and reached the hospital still wearing her work apron. The doctor told her Jacob would be all right. When Melissa mentioned the dampness in their apartment and the mold near the bathroom, he warned her that those conditions could be making Jacob's symptoms harder to manage. If possible, he said, a drier place would be better for him. Melissa sat in the waiting room with Jacob asleep against her shoulder. She had days to find somewhere they could afford. Now she had to wonder whether the apartment she was struggling to keep was also making life harder for her son. A folded newspaper slid across the floor when the automatic doors opened. It stopped against her shoe. Melissa picked it up. Near the bottom of one page was a classified advertisement only a few lines long. Tiny house. For sale. $1. She read it twice. A house for the price of a cup of coffee sounded absurd. Probably a mistake. Possibly a scam. The eviction notice was still folded inside her coat. Melissa tore out the advertisement. The next morning, she called the number. An older woman answered. Her name was Eleanor Brooks. Melissa asked the question anyone would have asked. Why would anyone sell a house for $1? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Because I'm not looking for the highest bidder. Melissa waited for an explanation. None came. Eleanor gave her an address and invited her to see the property that afternoon. The house stood at the end of a gravel road in a quiet neighborhood. Its siding had faded. Several porch boards were cracked. Vines climbed toward the roof. The mailbox leaned to one side. Whatever $1 bought here, it did not buy perfection. Eleanor waited by the porch with silver hair tucked beneath a straw hat and a brass key in her hand. Inside, the house was small but carefully arranged. A shelf fitted neatly into one wall. A narrow cabinet occupied a corner where most builders would have wasted the space. The windows seemed placed with unusual care. Years had worn down the building, yet its original design still showed through. Outside, a few neighbors had gathered. One man laughed when he heard Melissa was considering buying the place. Another said nobody had lived there for years. Someone else suggested that people had tried fixing it before and given up. Melissa listened without answering. A cheap house could still be an expensive mistake. She had almost no money for repairs. A collapsing roof would not become safe just because the purchase price was $1. She started back toward the car. Jacob was standing beside the crooked mailbox, staring at the house. "What are you doing?" Melissa asked. He studied the front windows. "It doesn't look sad anymore." Melissa smiled faintly. Jacob added, "I think it was waiting for somebody." Eleanor had used almost the same idea earlier. Melissa did not treat it as a sign. Jacob was 6. He was not calculating property values or repair costs. He was imagining a front door they might be allowed to keep. Melissa turned toward Eleanor. "If I take it, the price really is $1. According to Eleanor, it was. Melissa reached into her purse and handed her a single dollar. Eleanor placed the brass key in Melissa's hand. By that afternoon, Melissa and Jacob were carrying boxes through the front door. The immediate question of where they would sleep had an answer. The house gave them plenty of new questions. The electricity was unreliable. The plumbing made noises in the night. Cold air slipped around old window frames. Melissa could not hire someone every time a problem appeared, so she made a list. Urgent repairs first. Cosmetic problems later. She bought only what she could manage. A small box of nails. A little paint. Sandpaper. She tightened a loose step and worked on the worst window drafts. When she did not know how to repair something, she learned enough to decide what could wait and what could not. Jacob became her helper. He held the flashlight. He handed her nails. Most evenings he asked the same question. "What are we fixing today?" Progress came slowly. The porch still leaned. The siding still showed its age. Yet the rooms became cleaner, the drafts less severe, and after several nights Melissa noticed Jacob was coughing less often. One evening, while she was making dinner, he said it himself. "Mom, I can breathe better here." Melissa paused with one hand on the stove. There was no way to know what every repair would cost or how long the house would hold together. Still, something she had chosen was finally moving them in a better direction. A few days later, Jacob's toy truck caught on the living room floor. That was how Melissa found the ridge. The pry bar lifted the board. Her hand reached into the dark space underneath. Her fingers closed around a rusted metal box. She pulled it into the light. Jacob leaned closer. "Is it treasure?" "I don't know." Melissa brushed dust from the lid and opened it. There was no gold. No jewelry. No old stack of cash. A bundle wrapped in faded blue cloth filled most of the box. Melissa unfolded it. Blueprints. Detailed drawings of small houses. Storage built into walls. Furniture designed to fold away. Windows positioned to bring light into compact rooms. Pencil notes covered the margins. On several pages were the same initials. A.H. Beneath the drawings was an envelope. 5 words were written across the front. "For whoever calls this home." The short message inside said that a home should not be judged only by its size. Its real measure was the peace it gave the people living there. Melissa carried the papers to the kitchen table. At first, she studied them out of curiosity. Soon she noticed a problem. One hallway on the blueprint seemed longer than the hallway in the house. She checked another page. Same result. According to the drawing, the structure continued several feet beyond a wall that appeared completely solid. The box beneath the floor had answered one question. It had also created a larger one. If the blueprint was accurate, part of the house seemed to be missing. The next evening, Melissa borrowed a tape measure. She started with the rooms that appeared easiest to compare. The living room width was close. The window placement matched. The kitchen wall sat where the drawing indicated. She moved into the hallway. Melissa stretched the tape from one end to the other. Measured once. Measured again. According to the blueprint, there should have been nearly 4 more feet beyond the wall in front of her. Jacob stood behind her. So there's another room? I don't know. Melissa let the tape retract. But these numbers don't match. Old houses settled. Builders sometimes changed plans during construction. A drawing alone could not prove that a hidden space existed. The difference was large enough to test. Melissa pressed along the wall. Nothing moved. She examined the trim and the baseboard. No obvious opening. Jacob began knocking on the paneling. One knock produced a dull thud. A second sounded the same. His hand moved several inches. The next knock sounded different. Hollow. Mom. Melissa tried it herself. Solid. Solid. Hollow. Her fingertips moved along the painted trim. Years of paint had covered nearly every small detail. A tiny metal edge remained visible. A brass screw. It did not match the other fasteners. Melissa brought over a screwdriver and turned it slowly. The screw came free. Nothing changed. She pressed the wall. Still nothing. A quiet click came from somewhere inside the panel. The narrow section of which shifted forward. Only a fraction of an inch. Enough to create a line of darkness along one edge. Jacob stepped closer. I think it opened. Melissa pulled carefully. The panel moved on old hinges. Behind it was a narrow passage. The air smelled of cedar, dust, and old paper. Melissa brought a flashlight and told Jacob to stay behind her. They stepped inside. The passage ended at a wooden door. Its surface had been protected better than the surrounding wall. There was no visible lock. Only a short sentence carved into the wood. Not every treasure shines. Jacob read it slowly. What does that mean? Melissa put her hand on the handle. I think we're about to find out. The door opened. Dust floated through the flashlight beam. A drafting table stood beneath a small skylight. Shelves covered the walls. Wooden tubes held rolled drawings. Rulers, measuring tools, and pencils remained near the table. A faded work jacket hung from a hook. The room had the order of a place once used every day. No chest of coins waited in the corner. No jewelry had been hidden behind the wall. What remained here was someone's work. Jacob moved toward the drafting table. A black and white photograph rested beside a leather notebook. He carried the photograph to Melissa. A woman sat on the porch of a small house beside a boy. Behind them stood the same building Melissa now owned. The porch was straight in the photograph. The siding was newer. The roofline and windows were unmistakable. Someone had written beneath the image. Everything I built began with her. Melissa opened the notebook. On the first page was a name. Arthur Harrison. The initials finally belonged to someone. The journal was the only account Melissa had of the man behind those letters, and what she learned about him came from the pages he had left behind. Arthur described a career designing expensive houses for wealthy clients. He wrote about large rooms, custom work, and projects built for people with enough money to choose almost anything. Professional success had followed. His entries changed when he began writing about his wife. Her illness altered the rhythm of their lives. Arthur recorded conversations more often than medical details. One memory returned several times. His wife had told him that the happiest years of their marriage had not been spent in their largest house. They had been the early years, when they owned less, lived in a smaller space, and spent more time together. After her death, Arthur began drawing different kinds of homes. Melissa could see the change in the plans around her. The grand layouts disappeared. In their place were compact rooms, simple materials, built-in storage, furniture that could perform more than one function, and windows positioned to make modest spaces feel open. Arthur wrote about designing for people who rarely appeared in glossy architecture magazines. Widows. Veterans. Single parents. Families who could manage a modest home if someone built around what they actually needed. Melissa put down the journal and studied her own kitchen. The shelf fitted into the wall. The narrow cabinet. The window that caught the afternoon light. Those details had seemed clever before. Now they revealed a method. Every foot had been designed to do a job. Melissa kept reading over the following evenings. Arthur wrote less about recognition than about the families who occupied the homes. A parent who had expected to rent forever. A veteran who wanted a quiet place of his own. Small stories about people gaining control over one part of their lives. One entry stayed with Melissa. If even one child feels safe because of something I built, then my life mattered. She closed the notebook. Jacob was asleep in the next room. Melissa walked to his doorway. His breathing was steady. No coughing in that moment. Just the ordinary sound of a child sleeping. Arthur could never have known Melissa or Jacob. He had designed for a kind of need. Years later, they had arrived carrying it. For a while, Melissa kept the workshop quiet. She cleaned only what was necessary. The papers stayed dry. She moved nothing she did not understand. Word eventually spread beyond the house. Neighbors heard about the hidden passage. People interested in local history began examining the workshop and its contents. In the account, they connected Arthur Harrison to an earlier architectural career that had faded from public attention decades before. The room helped explain what he had done afterward. The rolled plans were more than old paper. Together, they showed a sustained effort to design smaller homes for people with limited choices. Curiosity grew. Visitors wanted to see the workshop. Others wanted photographs. Eventually, someone wanted to buy the collection. A company made Melissa an offer for Arthur's journals and original drawings. The offer was large enough to change her calculations. Past due bills could disappear. The repairs could become easier. She might be able to stop cleaning offices at night. She could be home when Jacob went to sleep. For someone who had spent years measuring every purchase against the next bill, the choice was not simple. Melissa stood inside the workshop and studied Arthur's drafting table. The worn jacket still hung nearby. The photograph remained where she had found it. She opened the journal again. Arthur had spent the later part of his life trying to create choices for people who had very few. The envelope beneath Melissa's floor had been addressed to whoever called the house home. Nothing in the journal told her exactly what Arthur would have wanted done with every page. His larger purpose was harder to miss. For most of Melissa's adult life, money had made decisions for her. It decided which apartment she could rent. Which groceries could wait. How many hours she had to work. Which repair had to be postponed. Now money was offering her something instead. For once, the decision belonged to her. Melissa made it the next morning. She contacted the company. Her answer was no. When someone later asked why she had turned down the offer, she kept the explanation short. I don't think these were meant to belong to one person. Refusing the money did not restore the workshop. The roof still needed attention. The porch still needed work. Old paper had to be handled carefully. Melissa knew enough by then to recognize the limits of what she could do alone. She asked for help. People began showing up. Some came because they were curious. Others knew something about old buildings or carpentry. One Saturday morning, a man appeared on the porch carrying a toolbox. Melissa recognized him as one of the neighbors who had laughed when she first arrived. He had also walked past while she was repairing the porch and told her that some things were not worth saving. Now he stood awkwardly near the steps. "I was wrong about you," he said. "And I was wrong about this place." Melissa glanced at the toolbox. She handed him a paintbrush. "Then help us finish it." He stayed. Over the following weeks, damaged boards were replaced. Shelves were cleaned. The concealed passage was made safer. Arthur's drawings were protected rather than carried casually from room to room. People with more experience helped identify what could be repaired and what should be left alone. Jacob watched everything. Sometimes he handed people tools. Other times he sat at Arthur's drafting table with a sheet of paper and copied shapes from the old plans. The same house that had once drawn laughter now drew people carrying lumber, brushes, measuring tapes, and boxes of supplies. Nearly a year after Melissa paid $1 for it, people gathered outside the house again. This time, the hidden workshop inside had been restored as a small community learning space. Arthur's surviving plans could be studied there. Young people interested in architecture and practical building could see how he had used limited space. Built-in storage. Simple layouts. Rooms that served more than one purpose. The drawings that had spent decades rolled inside a hidden room were being opened across the drafting table again. A bronze plaque was placed near the porch. It carried the sentence Melissa had first encountered in Arthur's papers. "A home is measured by the peace it gives the people inside." Jacob stood beside her. He watched students carrying drawing tubes toward the workshop. "Mom." "What?" "Remember when everybody laughed?" Melissa looked at the repaired porch. The mailbox stood straighter now. The siding still showed its age. No one had tried to turn the small house into something grand. "I remember." Jacob watched the people going inside. "They're not laughing anymore." "No," Melissa said. "They're not." Arthur's journals and blueprints remained with the collection. The workshop continued to be used. His designs had survived long enough to reach people he would never meet. Months later, Melissa closed the workshop at the end of another Saturday. The last visitors had gone. A few pencils rested near the edge of the drafting table. She switched off the light and stepped onto the porch. Jacob was waiting there. He was older than the 6-year-old who had followed her into the house carrying a backpack while she wondered how they would make it through the next week. Melissa sat beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke. Jacob eventually asked, "Do you think Dad would have liked our house?" Melissa thought about the years before they arrived. The long shifts. The orange notice. The hospital waiting room. A newspaper sliding across the floor. A brass key. A toy truck stopping on an uneven board. Cold metal beneath her fingertips. And a set of blueprints drawn by a man who believed a child feeling safe was enough reason for his work to matter. Melissa put an arm around Jacob. "I think he would have loved it." The porch light came on behind them. Inside, Arthur Harrison's blueprints and journals remained with the workshop. Students still leaned over the drafting table where his pencils had once rested. Near the porch, the plaque carried the sentence that had connected his work to Melissa's life. "A home is measured by the peace it gives the people inside." When Melissa first received the brass key, she had been thinking about one thing. Having a door no one could immediately tell her to leave. Now a family lived behind that door. Arthur's work was being used again. And the boy who had once struggled to breathe in a damp apartment sat beside his mother, certain that this was home. The house had cost $1. Its purpose had taken much longer to understand.